There was once a teacher whose life wasn't shaped by grand achievements or prestigious accolades, but by a quiet, steady devotion to her students and the lessons she imparted, not only in the classroom but in the hearts of those she taught. Her name was Mrs. Adams, and for years, she had walked the halls of the school as an embodiment of patience, kindness, and resilience. Her journey to this point had been neither easy nor smooth, but rather a series of small, life-altering moments that she had turned into lessons, ones that shaped the way she taught and the way she cared for each student. Born into a modest family in a small town, Mrs. Adams had always been the quiet observer, the one who sat at the back of the classroom, watching how people interacted, how life unfolded around her. She was the type of child who preferred the company of books to the noise of the playground, the type of student who asked questions not for the sake of answering but because she truly wanted to understand the world in all its complexities. Her parents, though loving, had little in the way of education beyond high school, but they instilled in her a value that would stay with her for life, the importance of learning and the power it held to transform lives. Mrs. Adams's path to teaching wasn't an obvious one at first. After high school, she found herself torn between pursuing a career in the arts or going into education. She had a love for literature and an incredible talent for writing, but something about the idea of making a difference in the lives of others called to her more strongly. It was a quiet conversation with her high school English teacher, a woman who had noticed her potential long before Mrs. Adams ever did, that set the course for her life. "You have a gift for teaching," Mrs. Adams's teacher had told her, eyes kind yet firm. "You don't need to save the world to make an impact. You just need to touch one person's heart at a time." And so, Mrs. Adams took the path that led her to the classroom. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't always easy. There were long days, late nights spent grading papers and planning lessons. There were students who struggled, who didn't quite understand, who seemed to give up before they even began. But in every one of those challenges, Mrs. Adams found an opportunity to help, to encourage, to believe when no one else did. She remembered what it felt like to be uncertain, to doubt yourself, and so she offered her students the same thing she had once been given, a chance to believe that their struggles didn't define them, but their efforts did. The years passed, and Mrs. Adams became a fixture in the school. She wasn't the teacher who sought the spotlight, never the one who wanted the accolades or praise. Her rewards were quieter, a struggling student turning in an essay with a smile instead of a frown, a hesitant voice speaking up in class, or the subtle nod of understanding in a student's eyes as they grasped a concept they had once thought impossible. But there were moments that tested her, 2 times when she doubted if what she was doing was enough, if her efforts mattered. One such time came when a student named Jake, a boy who had been a challenge from the first day, faced an overwhelming personal tragedy. His father, a man Mrs. Adams had never met but had heard so much about, passed away suddenly. Jake's grades plummeted. He withdrew, becoming the very opposite of the bright, curious boy he once was. Mrs. Adams could have let him go. She could have told herself that some students were simply beyond saving, but she couldn't. She had seen too many sparks in Jake to let them fizzle out. She took him aside, spoke with him after class, and gently offered him the kind of space he needed to heal without judgment, without pressure. It wasn't a quick fix, but little by little, Jake began to trust again. One day, he came to her with a piece of writing, a raw, emotional account of the loss he had suffered, and she could see in his words the healing that had begun. That moment, more than any test or academic achievement, proved to her that teaching wasn't just about imparting knowledge, it was about being there for the moments that couldn't be taught. And in the years that followed, Mrs. Adams continued to teach, continuing to pour herself into each lesson, each student, each day. She taught English, but she also taught life. She taught empathy, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from facing hardship with dignity. She understood, more than anyone else, that students didn't come to school just to learn math or science, they came to discover themselves, to be seen, to be understood. She didn't always have the answers, but she always had the patience to listen, the wisdom to guide, and the heart to love her students as if they were her own. When she eventually retired, the halls felt a little emptier without her quiet presence. Her students, now grown and scattered in different walks of life, still carried with them the lessons Mrs. Adams had taught them, not in textbooks or lesson plans, but in the way they approached the world with kindness and determination. Her impact, though subtle, had shaped generations. And in the hearts of those who had been fortunate enough to sit in her classroom, Mrs. Adams would always be remembered not just as a teacher, but as a guiding light, one who had not only taught them to think but had shown them the power of believing in themselves, even when the world felt like it might break them. The day the teacher arrived at the school, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the old, weathered building. For the children, it felt like a new chapter was about to unfold, although they couldn't yet put words to the anticipation that stirred in their hearts. Mrs. Elizabeth Montgomery had taught in countless schools before, but there was something different about this place. It was as if the walls of the school had been waiting for her, waiting for someone who would see the potential in the crumbling bricks and faded chalkboards. She stepped out of her car and, for a moment, looked at the school from across the yard. The faded red doors and cracked windows told stories of past years, some of them good, some not so much. The air was thick with the scent of freshly mown grass, and there was a quiet stillness, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. Mrs. Montgomery felt a deep sense of purpose within her as she walked toward the building, the weight of her responsibility settling onto her shoulders like an old, familiar coat. She had always believed in the power of education, in its ability to change lives, but she had also learned that it was never the curriculum that mattered most, it was the students, the souls behind the desks, the ones who carried with them hopes and fears, dreams and doubts, often hidden beneath layers of experiences they didn't yet understand. Her shoes clicked against the concrete, and with each step, she felt the enormity of the task ahead. Her students would come in with their own stories, each of them battling something different, whether it was a broken home, a struggle with self-worth, or simply the weight of the world that had already begun to make itself known to them too early. Mrs. Montgomery had seen it all before, but there was something about this school, something about this group of children, that made her heart ache with a mixture of empathy and hope. When she entered the classroom for the first time, it was like stepping into a different world. The room smelled faintly of dust and chalk, with little else to make it feel alive. The desks were old, worn from years of use, and some were missing their chairs. The blackboard, though large, was faded, its surface cracked in places, but it still held the potential to inspire. She could almost hear the voices of past teachers, long gone, whispering in the corners of the room, as if passing the torch to her. She stood there for a long moment, allowing the silence to settle around her. It was then that she heard the faintest sound, the shuffle of feet in the hallway. The students were arriving. One by one, they filtered into the room, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some were already familiar with the school's history, others were newcomers to this quiet corner of the world. They didn't know what to expect from her, and she didn't know what to expect from them. There was a nervous energy in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mrs. Montgomery looked around, meeting the eyes of each child as they entered, offering them a soft smile, a wordless invitation to step into a new world, a world where they would be seen, where their voices would be heard, and where their dreams would be nurtured. She could sense their hesitation, their fears, and the weight of their expectations. They had been let down before, by teachers who had walked through that same door but never truly saw them. They were used to being overlooked, to being told what to do without anyone really understanding what they needed. But Mrs. Montgomery wasn't like that. She was different. As the last child took their seat, the room grew quiet. The teacher stood in front of them, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She knew she had to make a choice. Would she stand before them as just another authority figure, a distant figure that spoke at them and told them what to do? Or would she be the one who made them feel that they mattered? She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice calm but steady. She wasn't sure how they would respond, but she knew she had to begin somewhere. "I know," she said softly, her eyes scanning the room, "that some of you may have had experiences that have made it hard to believe in people. You may have been told that you weren't enough, that you couldn't do something. But I want you to know something." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. "You are enough. You are more than enough." The room was still, the silence heavy with a mix of disbelief and hope. Mrs. Montgomery's words had cut through the air like a knife, breaking the stillness and planting the seed of something new, something that could grow, given time, trust, and care. And though it was just the beginning, for Mrs. Montgomery and her students alike, it felt like a turning point. The weight of their shared journey was heavy, but it was also full of possibility. As the lesson began, with each word spoken, each student's expression softened just a little. For the first time in a long while, they felt seen. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they could be more. As the sun's first rays stretched across the sky, bathing the small town in a soft, golden glow, the teacher arrived at the school. Her heart, heavy with the weight of unspoken expectations, beat with a mix of excitement and fear, a rhythm she had carried for years. Today marked the beginning of another year, a fresh start, but also a reminder of the endless challenges that lay ahead. She stepped out of her car, the air crisp and cool, brushing against her face as if to remind her that the world was still turning, regardless of the uncertainties she carried within. The school loomed ahead, an old brick building with ivy climbing its walls, a place that held memories, both joyful and painful, of countless students who had walked through its doors before her. She had been here long enough to know its every creak and sigh, the hum of its ancient pipes, the way the wind whispered through its classrooms. But today, everything felt different, more fragile, more uncertain. With every step she took toward the entrance, her thoughts wandered to the faces of the children she would soon meet, each one a world unto themselves, each one holding stories she would never fully understand. The weight of her responsibility settled on her shoulders, a burden she had never quite learned to carry lightly. She had chosen this profession out of a love for learning, a passion for nurturing young minds, but somewhere along the way, the pressure had started to feel too much, too overwhelming. The state mandates, the ever-increasing demands of parents, the constant pressure to perform, it all piled up in ways that made her wonder if she could give enough of herself to truly make a difference. As she crossed the threshold of the building, the familiar scent of chalk dust and old wood filled her senses, grounding her in the moment. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, a quiet reminder that she was once again stepping into a place where lives would be shaped, not only by her lessons, but by her presence. The school was silent for now, the halls empty, but she knew that in a few hours, they would be filled with the laughter, chatter, and chaos of children eager to learn, or perhaps, like her, nervous about what the day would bring. She stopped for a moment, staring at the bulletin board that stood near the entrance. It was adorned with colorful posters celebrating student achievements, upcoming events, and words of encouragement. It was the same as it had always been, but today, it seemed somehow more meaningful, more significant. It was a reminder that her job was more than just teaching. It was about fostering a sense of belonging, of community, of hope. She had always believed in the power of education to change lives, to create possibilities, but as the years had passed, that belief had been tested. She had seen too many children walk through those doors carrying burdens far heavier than any textbook could ever explain. Some came from homes filled with love, others from places where kindness was scarce, where dreams were stifled by circumstances beyond their control. She had seen students struggle with learning disabilities, with broken homes, with trauma that no child should ever have to endure. And yet, she had also seen them triumph, slowly and quietly, finding their way, discovering their voices, growing into something greater than they had ever imagined. It was this quiet strength, this resilience, that kept her going when the days felt too long and the nights too silent. The bell rang, a sharp, metallic sound that broke the silence, signaling the start of a new day. Her nerves fluttered in her chest, but she straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked toward her classroom. She had no idea what the day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: it was her job, her calling, to be there for her students, no matter what. The door to her classroom stood open, waiting. She stepped inside, the space as familiar as her own reflection. Desks were arranged in neat rows. The bulletin board at the front of the room proudly displayed a quote she had chosen last year: "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." It was a message she believed with all her heart, even when it seemed like the world itself was too broken to be fixed. She didn't have all the answers, but she had hope, and that was enough for now. With a final glance around the room, she knew that, for all the doubts and struggles she faced, this was where she was meant to be. Her students would come, and together, they would navigate the challenges, the triumphs, and the lessons of the year ahead. In that moment, the fear and uncertainty melted away, replaced by a quiet determination to do her best, to give them everything she had to offer, to make a difference, even if it was just one life at a time. Beneath the wide expanse of a bruised sky, where the thunder rolled like a distant drum beat, Emma stood alone on the edge of a weather-beaten pier, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She could feel the weight of everything around her growing colder with each passing moment, as if the universe itself was reflecting the tension in her chest. Her life had been a series of small, unspoken promises, each one more fragile than the last, and the storm on the horizon felt like the culmination of every decision she had ever made. She had always told herself that things would get better, that love, with its quiet promise, would be enough to shield her from the hardships of the world. But standing there now, watching the first few drops of rain splatter against the wood beneath her feet, Emma felt the sharp edge of truth cut through her. She had been wrong. The relationship she had fought so hard to save was unraveling before her eyes, a slow, agonizing process that neither of them seemed able to halt. She had tried God, how she had tried. For years, she had poured herself into him, into the hope that he would change, that one day he would see her not as someone to be rescued, but as someone to be loved. But now, she saw it in his eyes, the distant, unreachable look that had replaced the warmth they once shared. The love was gone, swallowed up by their silences, by the deepening gap that had started as something small, a forgotten promise, an unmet need, and had slowly grown, nurtured by neglect and unspoken hurt. He never said it, but she knew. He was already gone. She had spent so much of her life giving, trying to make him feel seen, understood, needed. She had learned to accept the silence in place of affection, the empty gestures that once held so much meaning. But now, in the piercing loneliness of that moment, Emma realized that she had been waiting for him to come back, for him to wake up and remember what they had. But he never would. A sob rose in her throat, thick and unrelenting, but she swallowed it down. The weight of her own weakness pressed against her chest, and she hated it. She had always prided herself on being strong, on facing the world with a quiet resolve. But in this moment, standing on the edge of that pier, Emma felt like she might break apart. The sound of his footsteps behind her shattered the stillness, and though she didn't turn around, she knew it was him. He had come, as he always did, when the distance between them became too unbearable to ignore. His presence was a shadow, something that loomed over her but never truly touched her. She could feel the breath of the storm on her skin, the growing tension in the air, but it was the silence between them that felt the heaviest. "I don't know what to say, Emma," he said, his voice distant, almost tired. She didn't respond, her hands clutched tightly at her sides, as if she could hold herself together by sheer force. She didn't need to hear the words again, didn't need the hollow assurances that things would get better, that they could still fix it. She had heard them all before, too many times to count. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fix. She had given him all of herself, her love, her patience, her trust, but in the end, it had never been enough. She had always been waiting for him to come back, to see her, to love her the way she had always dreamed. But he never would. The realization was bitter, the grief raw and unfiltered. It felt as if the ground beneath her feet might disappear at any moment, leaving her suspended between the past and the future, both of them just out of reach. The rain began to fall harder, and Emma felt the cold droplets against her skin, but they didn't sting, not like the pain that had been eating at her for months, for years, a slow and steady erosion of everything she had believed in. She had loved him, with a fierceness that she had never known she was capable of, and now she had nothing left to give. No more energy, no more hope, no more love. All of it had been spent on a promise that had never been kept. She closed her eyes, letting the rain wash over her, the storm a reflection of the turmoil inside. The conflict had been building for so long, quiet at first, a shadow lurking in the corners of their conversations. But now it was here, the storm that would finally break them. Emma knew it, and though the pain of it felt unbearable, she also knew that it was time to let go. It was time to stop waiting for him to return to her, to stop holding on to something that had already slipped away. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, and Emma finally turned, her eyes meeting his one last time. There were no words left to say. No promises. No hope. Only the soft, inevitable truth that both of them were already lost in different ways. The storm raged on, but Emma stood there, no longer waiting for it to pass. She was ready to move on, to step into the unknown, without him. The teacher stood before her class, a warm smile on her face, but behind her eyes, a quiet storm brewed. She had seen the world in ways many of her students could never imagine, and it was in the gentle creases of her eyes and the softness in her voice that the weight of those experiences lived. Years ago, she had come from a small, impoverished town, where hope was a fleeting shadow, and dreams felt distant, like stars that only the fortunate could touch. Yet, despite the limitations that surrounded her, she had never allowed her heart to accept the confines of her circumstances. Driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge, she clawed her way out of the darkness, finding solace in books and learning. But it wasn't just academic achievement that called to her, it was the desire to heal, to give back, to offer the same sense of possibility that had once been given to her by teachers who believed in her when she could barely believe in herself. She had worked countless hours, fueled by ambition and an undying will to prove that one's past need not define their future. Along the way, she encountered obstacles that might have broken others, a lack of resources, a system that felt indifferent, and at times, her own doubts. Yet, she never wavered. The fire inside her was not only for her own success but for the generations that would follow. It was a flame she nurtured with every lesson she taught, every student she mentored, and every moment she gave them the belief that their lives could be whatever they dreamed. The teacher's strength, however, came not from what she had accomplished, but from the scars she bore, those invisible markers of resilience and empathy. She remembered the nights she sat alone, staring at textbooks and notes, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her bones, knowing that her dreams were still so far from reach. Yet, in each classroom, she found joy in the faces of students who, perhaps unknowingly, reminded her of herself. She had been that young girl who lacked confidence, who questioned her worth, and who felt lost in a world too vast to understand. But it was in the eyes of her students that she found her purpose. She saw them in their triumphs and struggles, and she poured every ounce of herself into guiding them through the maze of life, hoping to spare them from some of the heartaches she had known. She listened to their stories, shared in their laughter and tears, and for some, she became the first person to tell them they mattered. Through her own experiences, she understood the power of encouragement. When a student faltered, when doubt clouded their minds, she was there to remind them of their worth, to show them that failure was not the end, but simply another step in the journey toward greatness. She had learned this herself, many times over. She had failed, fallen short, and faced rejection, but each time, she picked herself up with an unwavering belief that tomorrow was another chance to rise again. She shared that belief with her students not just through words, but through actions. Her classroom became a sanctuary, a place where the weight of the world outside could be temporarily lifted. The students who once sat in silence, withdrawn and unsure, found their voices in her presence. Those who felt invisible were suddenly seen. She had a gift, a rare one, to make others feel like they mattered, and it was in this that her true strength lay. Her past, with its pain and challenges, had shaped her into someone who understood that teaching was more than just imparting knowledge. It was about fostering a sense of worth, of belonging, and of hope. She had learned that the greatest gift a teacher could give was not a perfect lesson plan or flawless execution, it was the ability to make students believe in themselves. When they left her classroom, they carried more than just academic knowledge, they carried a part of her strength, a piece of her heart that would stay with them long after they had moved on. As the years passed, she grew older, but the passion for her work never dulled. It only deepened, and each class she taught became another chapter in her story, a story of resilience, love, and unwavering belief in the potential of others. Through the eyes of her students, she saw not just young faces but reflections of herself, reminders of her own journey, of how far she had come, and of how much further she could still go. There was a boy named Evan, quiet and kind-hearted, a soul who lived in the small town of Pine Brook, a place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. At school, Evan stood out not because of his confidence, but because of his vulnerability. His glasses always slipped down his nose, his clothes never quite matching the latest trends, and his hair seemed to have a mind of its own, often sticking out in every direction. In a world where appearances spoke louder than words, he felt invisible, but not in a way that made him feel safe. The bullies saw him, and they knew exactly how to hurt him. Every day, it seemed, they had new ways to torment him. It started with whispered taunts and cruel jokes, things Evan tried to ignore, but the laughter, the sharpness of their words, cut through him like a knife. He couldn't escape it. Even though he would shrink into the corners of classrooms, behind the books, trying to remain unseen, their voices always found him. Sometimes it was the mocking tone they used when calling his name, "Hey, Four Eyes," or "You're just a shadow in the hallway." Other times it was more physical shoves in the cafeteria line, papers thrown at him in the hallway, a quick, cruel trip when he least expected it. Every incident, every comment, left scars that Evan carried with him. The worst part was the sense of powerlessness that wrapped around him like a vice. It wasn't just the physical pain that made it unbearable, it was the constant reminder that he didn't belong, that he wasn't enough. There was one boy in particular, Tyler, who led the pack of bullies. With his cocky smile and confident stride, Tyler had a way of making everyone believe he was untouchable. His words were like daggers, designed to wound deeply. Evan often wondered what made Tyler so angry, why he felt the need to tear others down to feel superior. Was it insecurity? Was it something that happened at home? He would never know the answers, but one thing was certain, Tyler's cruel laughter filled Evan with a hopelessness that seemed unshakable. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the final bell of the day rang, Evan gathered his things and slowly walked out of the building, trying to avoid the usual crowd that waited to make his life harder. But on that day, fate had other plans. Tyler and his crew were waiting just outside the gates, leaning against the fence, smirking. As Evan approached, the group surrounded him, blocking his way. There was a moment of eerie silence, the kind where you can feel the air grow thick with anticipation. Tyler stepped forward, his eyes glinting with malice, and without warning, he shoved Evan against the brick wall, causing Evan's glasses to slip and his books to scatter across the pavement. The laughter that followed was deafening, a cruel symphony that echoed in Evan's ears. But for the first time, something inside Evan shifted. Something deep within him stirred, a spark of anger, of frustration, of hurt that had been building for years. As he stood there, humiliated, his heart racing, something cracked in his chest. He had been broken over and over again, but in that moment, he realized that he had a choice. He could let them win, let their cruelty define him, or he could stand up, however small or insignificant it might seem. With trembling hands, Evan pushed himself away from the wall. He didn't shout, didn't fight back with words, but there was something in his eyes, a silent strength, an unspoken defiance. The bullies paused, as if taken aback by the quiet resolve in his stance. Tyler narrowed his eyes, confusion flashing across his face. Evan didn't say anything, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't going to let them break him any longer. With that, Tyler sneered, and the group slowly stepped back, the power dynamic shifting, if only slightly. The day didn't end in victory or with applause, but it was a quiet moment of reclaiming something that had been stolen from him for so long, his sense of self-worth. Evan didn't need to be loud or confrontational to show strength. Sometimes, simply refusing to let others define you was the bravest thing you could do. He walked away from the group that day, still feeling the sting of their words, but with the knowledge that no one could take away his dignity without his consent. It wasn't an easy journey. Evan would face more battles in the coming weeks and months, but that day, he learned something important. Bullies may try to tear you down, but they cannot break you unless you let them. And Evan, in his own quiet way, refused to let them win. He had begun the long, painful process of finding himself again, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The support of a few true friends, and the quiet strength he now carried within him, would be the foundation of his resilience. In the quiet town of Glenwood, there lived a young teacher named Emma. To the outside world, she was just another face in a crowd of educators, but those who truly knew her understood that there was something uniquely special about the way she approached her work. She didn't just teach, she connected. Emma believed that every student who walked into her classroom carried a story, some more burdened than others. It was this understanding that made her not only a teacher but also a guide, a mentor, and, at times, a protector. Every morning, Emma would wake up before the sun, her thoughts already racing through the day ahead. She had a responsibility, a calling, that kept her awake long into the night. She spent hours planning her lessons, ensuring they were engaging, meaningful, and tailored to the needs of every student. But it wasn't the lesson plans that mattered most to Emma, it was the hearts and minds of the children who sat before her. And as the days passed, her heart grew heavier, burdened with the weight of unspoken stories that danced in the eyes of her students. There was Mia, a bright and bubbly girl who never seemed to stop smiling. But Emma noticed something in the way Mia's shoulders slumped as she entered the classroom every morning, a heaviness that didn't match her outward appearance. Then there was Ethan, a quiet boy who often sat at the back, never making a fuss but always seemingly lost in thought. Emma had seen the signs, the way Ethan's eyes would flicker with unease whenever the subject of home was brought up in conversation. There were others too, students with varying struggles, some visible, some hidden behind the facade of normalcy. Emma was no stranger to hardship. Her own childhood had been filled with challenges, and it was those struggles that fueled her passion for teaching. She understood the weight of feeling invisible, of fighting silent battles, of yearning for someone to notice the things that weren't said. And so, she made it her mission to see each of her students, not just as learners but as people with hopes, fears, and dreams of their own. She knew that in her classroom, every lesson was an opportunity not just to impart knowledge, but to heal, to encourage, and to inspire. One particular afternoon, Emma stood before her class, her heart heavy with concern. Today, they would be writing letters to their future selves, a project she hoped would help them reflect on their dreams, their challenges, and their personal growth. She believed that by looking ahead, her students could find the strength to face the present. But as she looked around, she saw the hesitation in their eyes. Some, like Mia, were eager to put pen to paper, while others, like Ethan, seemed to struggle with the task. As the students wrote, Emma moved quietly among them, offering words of encouragement. When she reached Ethan's desk, she paused. His hand hovered over the paper, his pen motionless. "Ethan," she said softly, "what's on your mind?" For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "I don't know what to say." Emma sat beside him, her gaze kind. "You don't have to have all the answers now. Just write whatever comes to you, no matter how small. Your story matters, Ethan." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something, vulnerability, perhaps, or relief. He nodded, then slowly began to write. Later that week, after the letters had been sealed and placed in envelopes, Emma received a message from Mia's mother. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of how to approach the teacher, but she felt compelled to share something. Mia's home life, it turned out, was far from perfect. There were struggles, not always visible on the outside. Emma's encouragement, her attention to detail, and her gentle support had made a difference. Mia had begun to open up at home about her fears, her anxieties, and the pressures she faced. Emma's heart swelled with gratitude, but it was bittersweet. She knew that her job didn't end with a single success, and that for every child who found their voice, there were others still struggling in silence. As the school year came to a close, Emma found herself reflecting on the journey. She had watched her students grow in ways that were both heartbreaking and beautiful. She had seen their confidence blossom, but she had also seen them falter. There were moments when she felt as though she wasn't doing enough, that her efforts would never be enough to heal all the wounds. But the quiet victories, those small, often unnoticed moments, kept her going. A smile that reached the eyes. A hand raised in class. A letter that spoke of dreams once buried. And so, Emma continued. Every day, she poured herself into her work, believing in the unseen impact she had. She had come to understand that teaching wasn't just about lessons and grades, it was about recognizing the humanity in each student and helping them discover their own worth. The journey wasn't always easy, and the weight of her responsibility often felt overwhelming. But in her heart, Emma knew that even the smallest ripple of change could create a wave of transformation. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful lesson of all. In the quiet, sun-dappled hallways of Jefferson High School, Mr. Andrews was known for his calm demeanor, his quiet authority, and his unshakable patience. A seasoned teacher of history, he seemed an unlikely figure to inspire awe until the day his hidden past was unexpectedly revealed. For years, his students had marveled at his serene presence, his ability to manage even the rowdiest classrooms with a level of grace that no one could quite understand. What they didn't know was that Mr. Andrews had once been a martial arts champion skilled in the ancient discipline of karate. It had been a part of his life, a central thread in his identity, before he hung up his black belt and turned to teaching. But everything changed one fateful afternoon, when a situation in the school escalated in a way no one anticipated. It began when a fight broke out between two students, loud and vicious, just outside his classroom door. His first instinct was to step in, but he hesitated. He had seen conflicts before, and usually, the teachers or the principal would intervene. However, this time, something felt different. The students were no longer just fighting, they were full of rage, fueled by deep-seated anger, and neither of them seemed to want to back down. The chaos escalated quickly, and as the fight spilled into the hallway, it began to draw attention from more and more onlookers. That's when Mr. Andrews made his decision. As the voices grew louder, as the punches started flying, Mr. Andrews stepped forward. His gaze was firm but calm as he approached the students. His posture, though unassuming, was a subtle echo of a long-forgotten discipline. In that moment, his eyes, though gentle, held a depth of experience that surprised even those who thought they knew him well. The students, in their fury, had no idea what was about to happen. As the larger of the two raised his fist, Mr. Andrews moved like lightning, his hands effortlessly redirecting the blow with the precision of someone who had practiced this art for years. There was no anger in his actions, no violence, just controlled force, a reflection of the karate philosophy he had once lived by. The students froze in shock as Mr. Andrews, with the same quiet intensity that he brought to his lessons, calmly separated them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, he spoke to them in a voice so steady, it seemed to still the air around them. "This isn't the way," he said simply, his words carrying more weight than any reprimand could. "You have power inside you. You have strength. But it must be controlled. Always. Don't let your anger control you. You control it." There was a long pause as the students, stunned and confused, stared at him. For the first time, they saw him not just as a teacher, but as a man, a person who had lived a life beyond the walls of the classroom. In that moment, something shifted. The students' anger faded, their breathing slowed, and they both looked down at the floor, embarrassed. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Andrews never spoke of that moment again, but the students carried it with them. They began to notice his quiet strength, the way he listened more than he spoke, and the way he handled challenges with such grace and poise. It was as if, through his actions, he had taught them a lesson more powerful than any textbook could ever convey. His students began to respect him not just for the knowledge he imparted but for the silent wisdom he embodied, a wisdom that came from years of discipline, focus, and self-control. They learned that the true power was not in aggression, but in the ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. In the end, it wasn't just a lesson in karate that Mr. Andrews taught. It was a lesson in life, that strength is not always about force, and that real courage lies in the ability to stay centered, even when everything around you is falling apart. The transformation in his students was palpable, as they grew more reflective, more self-aware. The quiet teacher had become their role model, not because he had proven his physical prowess, but because he had shown them the power of peace. As the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the small town, Claire sat on the worn bench by the lake, her fingers lightly tracing the outline of a letter in her lap. The ink had faded slightly, as had the memories it held within, but the weight of those words still lingered just as heavy as when they were first written, a decade ago. She had spent most of her life running from it, but now, as she faced the final moments of her journey, the time had come to reconcile with the past that had shaped her, the pain she had buried, and the love she had lost. For years, Claire had been haunted by the thought of what might have been, her mind playing over the events that had torn apart the very fabric of her heart. The letter, written by her mother on the day she left, had always been a bittersweet reminder of the things left unsaid. It spoke of promises broken and dreams abandoned, of a love that had once been unshakable but had frayed at the edges until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. As Claire read it again, a sense of finality washed over her, and she realized that the story she had told herself for so long, the one that painted her mother as a villain, as the person who had walked away, wasn't the whole truth. Her mother had been afraid, just like she was now. Afraid of failing, of losing the only thing that had ever mattered to her. And in the end, that fear had led to her departure. She had left to protect what little was left of herself, a choice that Claire had never understood until now. She could see it now, the complexity, the pain, the silent surrender that both of them had endured, each in their own way. The love between them had been fractured, but not entirely gone. It had simply been buried beneath layers of hurt and misunderstanding. Claire's heart clenched as she remembered her mother's face the last time they had spoken, the tears in her eyes, the quiet apology she had never uttered. In that moment, Claire knew her mother had been waiting for the day when they would find each other again, but life had intervened in ways that neither of them had expected. Claire had tried to move on, tried to bury the ache of abandonment under layers of accomplishments and relationships that had never quite filled the void. She had built walls, high and impenetrable, convinced that the only way to survive was to keep everyone at arm's length. But here she was, standing at the crossroads of her life, with the reflection of the past staring back at her in the tranquil water of the lake. There was no more running. It had taken her years, but Claire finally understood that healing didn't come from avoidance or from pretending that things could be fixed in an instant. It was a slow, painful process that demanded patience and self-compassion. With a deep breath, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her jacket, as though closing the door on that chapter of her life for good. She could not change the past, no matter how much she longed to, but she could finally let it go. The resolution wasn't in fixing everything or finding the perfect answers. It was in forgiving herself and in forgiving her mother. As the final rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire felt a lightness in her chest, a soft whisper of peace that had eluded her for so long. She stood up, her eyes lingering on the stillness of the lake, and as she turned away, she took her first steps toward the future with an open heart. The weight of the years, of the unresolved pain, was no longer hers to carry. It had taken a lifetime to get here, but Claire was finally ready to embrace the freedom that came with letting go. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking forward, towards something new, a life unburdened by past regrets, a life that held the promise of second chances, not just with others, but with herself.